Most people think a war between the United States and Iran would last about 2 weeks. The US has the most powerful military on the planet. It has aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, precision missiles, and a defense budget that is larger than the next 10 countries combined. Iran, by comparison, has an economy badly damaged by years of sanctions, an air force flying old jets, and no nuclear weapon to deter an attack. So on paper, the outcome seems obvious. The US attacks, Iran collapses, the whole thing is over before the news cycle moves on. But here is what that way of thinking gets completely wrong. A war is not decided by who has the biggest weapons on day one. A war, especially the kind of grinding, costly, complicated war that would happen if the US ever moved against Iran, is decided by something much harder to measure. It is decided by how long each side can absorb pain. It is decided by how many problems one side can create for the other. It's decided by whether the attacker can actually hold and control what it has taken, or whether it bleeds slowly from 1,000 cuts until it decides the whole thing was not worth it. And Iran has spent decades, not weeks, not months, but decades, preparing for exactly that kind of fight. What Iran has built is not a plan to defeat the United States in a direct fight. It is something far more realistic and in many ways far more dangerous. It is a plan to make any attack so costly, so complicated, and so drawn out that the United States eventually decides to stop. When you look carefully at what Iran has actually built and what it has actually done, you realize that this plan already has 4 very clear steps, and those steps are already in motion. Let us go through them one by one, starting from the very beginning, so that even if you have never thought much about this before, you can follow exactly what is happening and why it matters. Asterisk. Step 1. Make the ground so difficult that no army wants to walk on it. Start with the most basic question anyone planning an invasion has to answer. After your bombs and missiles do their initial damage, you need soldiers on the ground. You need to physically occupy the country. You need to control the cities, the roads, the government buildings, the oil facilities, and that is where every serious invasion either succeeds or begins its slow, painful failure. Iran is not a small country. It is not a city that can be surrounded and taken in a week. Iran is roughly 3 times the size of France. It has mountains along almost every border. The Zagros Mountains in the west are massive, running for nearly 1,500 kilometers, and they create natural defensive barriers that armies have found extremely difficult to move through for thousands of years. The north has the Alborz mountain range. The east is bordered by desert and difficult terrain. The country's geography alone makes the idea of a quick ground invasion extremely complicated before a single shot is fired. But geography is just the beginning. Inside that geography, Iran has spent years building up a specific kind of military force that is designed for exactly this situation. It is not designed to fight the United States in open fields where American technology would dominate. It is designed to fight inside cities, inside mountains, inside tunnels, in the dark. Close quarters, where the advantage of expensive aircraft and long-range missiles shrinks dramatically. Iran has a force called the Islamic Revolutionary. Forget the name and think about what it actually is. It is a military organization with hundreds of thousands of trained fighters whose entire purpose is not to win a conventional battle, but to make occupation impossible. They are trained to blend into the population. They are trained in small group tactics. They know the terrain of every city and every valley in the country. They've been practicing for this specific scenario for a long time. The United States learned a brutal lesson about this kind of warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. After the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003, the US military defeated the conventional Iraqi army in about 3 weeks. The large battles were over quickly. The US controlled the skies, destroyed armored columns, and toppled the government. By that measure, the invasion was a success. Then the real war started. Fighters who could not win in open battles disappeared into cities. They placed bombs in roads. They attacked supply lines. They targeted soldiers in small groups. They made it dangerous to be anywhere at any time. The US spent the next 8 years, trying to manage a country that had been militarily defeated but refused to be controlled. The cost was enormous. Thousands of American soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. The financial cost ran into trillions of dollars. And in the end, the United States withdrew without achieving the stable, only country it had imagined creating. Iran watched all of this very close, and it has built its ground defense around exactly the lessons the US should have learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. The lesson is simple. You do not have to defeat the invader's army. You just have to make staying too expensive to be worth it. The Revolutionary Guard does not exist to fight a 2-week war. It exists to fight a 10-year war. It is already in place, already trained, and already positioned. That is step 1. Asterisk. Step 2. Build a network of allies that spreads the cost of any attack across the entire region. Asterisk. Now imagine you are the United States, and you are seriously planning an operation against Iran. You identify your targets. You plan your airstrikes. You think about what comes after. And then your military planners come back with a problem. It is not just Iran you have to worry about. The moment you attack Iran, a series of other groups and forces across the Middle East will almost certainly respond. And suddenly, a targeted operation against one country becomes a regional fire with flames in multiple places. This did not happen by accident. Iran spent roughly 3 decades deliberately building this network. Give it like a chess player who, instead of only protecting their own king, also places pieces on every important square across the entire board. Now, to put your king in danger, the opponent has to deal with threats coming from multiple directions at the same time. In Lebanon, Iran has spent years helping build and fund Hezbollah, which has grown into one of the most capable non-state military forces in the world. Hezbollah sits directly on Israel's northern border, has an enormous stockpile of rockets and missiles. Any major US military action against Iran would almost certainly trigger a massive Hezbollah response against Israel, which immediately complicates the situation for the United States, because Israel is America's closest partner in the region, and the US would face pressure to respond to that as well. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, which Iran has supported with weapons, training, and advice, demonstrated in 2023 and 2024 exactly how much damage a relatively small force can do to global trade. Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea forced major shipping companies to reroute around Africa, in weeks and significant cost to global trade routes. The US and UK launched airstrikes against Houthi positions repeatedly, and yet the attacks on shipping continued. A small force with basic weapons was able to disrupt one of the world's most important waterways, and there was no quick or clean answer to it. In Iraq, there are multiple armed groups with close ties to Iran that are embedded in Iraqi territory near American military bases. These groups demonstrated during periods of tension that they could launch regular rocket and drone attacks against US positions in the region. Full conflict, those groups would become active on a scale many times larger than anything seen so far. What this means in practice is that a US operation against Iran would not stay inside Iran's borders. They would spread. It would require the US military to simultaneously manage threats in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and potentially Syria. Every one of those fronts requires resources, attention, planning, and personnel. Every one of those fronts creates the possibility of American casualties, which creates political pressure at home. Every one of those fronts creates the possibility of the conflict expanding into something much larger and more complicated than the original operation was. Iran's network does not have to defeat the United States military. It just has to make the situation complicated enough, costly enough, and unpredictable enough that the political will to continue weakens over time. And it is worth noting that this network is already built. It already exists. It is already operational. Step 2 is not a future plan. It is a present reality. Past. Asterisk step 3. Keep the economy of the attacker bleeding to the oil card. There is something sitting underneath Iran and its neighbors that shapes almost every geopolitical decision in that part of the world, and it is not ideology or religion or nationalism, though all of those matter. It is oil, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. It is, at its narrowest point, only about 33 kilometers wide. And through that narrow strip of water flows roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Every single day, tankers carrying millions of barrels of oil move through that strait. Saudi Arabia exports through it. The United Arab Emirates exports through it. Kuwait exports through it. Iraq exports through it. A significant portion of the world's energy supply has to pass through that one narrow channel to reach the global market. Iran sits on the northern side of it. And Iran has spent years building up a specific capability to threaten that strait. It has fast attack boats, which are small, quick vessels that can swarm larger ships. It has anti-ship missiles positioned along its coast. It has mines that can be laid in the water to make navigation dangerous. It has submarines. And it has made very clear on multiple public occasions that in the event of any major military conflict, closing or severely disrupting the Strait of Hormuz would be one of its first responses. Now, think about what that actually means for the global economy. If the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted even partially, even temporarily, oil prices spike dramatically. When oil prices spike, the cost of everything that uses energy goes up. That means fuel, which affects transportation, which affects the cost of every product that needs to be moved from one place to another, which is almost every product. The economic ripple effect of a serious disruption in the strait would be felt immediately by ordinary people in the United States, in Europe and Asia, and basically every country that uses oil, which is every country in the world. This creates a political problem for any government that attacks Iran. Even if the military operation is going well by military standards, the economic pain being caused at home creates pressure from citizens, from businesses, from other governments. That pressure turns into political pressure on the leaders who made the decision to go to war, and that pressure can erode support for the war faster than any military setback can. This is not a hypothetical. When tensions between the US and Iran spiked in early 2020 following the killing of a senior Iranian commander, oil markets reacted immediately. Prices jumped within hours. Analysts began warning about what a sustained conflict would do to global energy markets. The economic threat does not even need to be fully executed to start having effects. The mere possibility of disruption changes behavior and creates costs. Iran understands this leverage clearly. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature on a map. It is a weapon that Iran holds against the global economy. And the threat of using it is, in many ways, more useful than actually using it, because an actual disruption would also hurt countries Iran needs to stay friendly with. But the credible threat of disruption changes how every government in the world thinks about supporting or participating in any operation against Iran. This is step 3 and has been in place for years. Step 4. Make the political cost inside the attacker's own country too high to continue. Wars are not just fought on battlefields. They are fought in living rooms, in newspaper columns, in parliamentary debates, and election campaigns. Every major military conflict the United States has been involved in over the past 50 years has eventually had to answer not just the military question of whether it was winning, but the political question of whether the country still supported fighting it. Vietnam is the clearest example. The United States military was never definitively defeated on the battlefield in Vietnam. American forces won the vast majority of individual engagements with the enemy, but the war went on for years. The casualties mounted, the costs grew, and eventually, the American public decided it was not worth it. Political support collapsed. Politicians who had backed the war began to distance themselves from it. Eventually, the US withdrew, because it lost militarily, but because it lost politically at home. Iraq followed the same pattern. Afghanistan followed the same pattern. Both were military operations that achieved their initial objective quickly. Both became long, grinding conflicts that eroded public support over years until the political cost of continuing became greater than the political cost of leaving. Iran has studied this pattern extremely carefully, and Iran's strategy is built, at least in part, on the assumption the United States has a specific political vulnerability. The American public, while willing to support a short, decisive military action, has repeatedly shown that it does not have the appetite for years of costly occupation with unclear goals and rising casualties. The political system in the United States is designed in a way that makes it very difficult to sustain unpopular wars over long periods. Elections come regularly. Politicians are sensitive to public opinion. The media environment amplifies every setback and every casualty. Iran does not need to make a US military operation fail in the first month. It just needs to make sure that after month 6, after month 12, after year 2, the political cost inside the United States has grown large enough that the public and the politicians begin asking whether it is worth continuing. And the way it does that is by combining all the other steps. The ground war in Iran becomes a slow, bloody, expensive effort because of step 1. The regional fires in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq stretch resources and create additional casualties because of step 2. Economic pain from oil disruption creates anger at home because of step 3. All of that feeds into step 4, which is the political collapse of support for the war in the attacking country. This is not a theory. This is a pattern that has repeated itself in American foreign policy multiple times in the last half-century. And Iran's strategy is explicitly designed around exploiting exactly that pattern. Asterisk. Why this plan is already working. Now here is something important to understand. This plan is not sitting in a drawer somewhere waiting to be activated. It is already in motion. You can see it working right now if you know where to look. Look at what happened in Yemen. The Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping starting in late 2023 were not a random event. They were a demonstration, a live exercise showing exactly how effective a relatively small, lightly equipped force, supported by Iranian weapons and training, could disrupt global commerce and put the United States in an impossible position. The US and UK launched strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen multiple times. Strikes happened. The attacks on shipping continued anyway. The US was pouring military resources into a situation with no clear endpoint and no obvious way to win. And it was happening in a country that most Americans could not find on a map before any major conflict with Iran had even started. Look at what happened in Iraq during the same period. Iranian-linked groups launched over 150 rocket and drone attacks against US military positions in Iraq and Syria between October 2023 and early 2024. US retaliated with strikes. The attacks continued. There were American casualties. The situation required constant military attention and resources, creating exactly the kind of steady drain on attention and willpower that Iran's strategy is designed to produce. Look at the political environment inside the United States. Even without a full conflict with Iran, debates about military involvement in the Middle East have been exhausting and divisive for years. Large portions of the American public on both the left and the right have grown deeply skeptical of further military commitments in the region. Political support for any new large-scale military action is fragile and would be extremely difficult to sustain through a long, costly campaign. All of this has happened before the United States has launched any direct major military operation against Iran. Iran's network is already active. The regional complications are already present. The economic leverage already exists. The political skepticism inside the US is already there. Iran has been building this situation for decades, and it is already in place. Ask. The most important thing to understand? Here's what most commentary about Iran the United States gets wrong. It frames the question as whether Iran is strong or weak, whether it is winning or losing, whether it is a threat or not. Those are the wrong questions because they assume that the contest is happening on a single simple scale where one side goes up and the other goes down. The real contest is about something different. It is about whether Iran can survive long enough and make any attack costly enough. The United States eventually decides the goal is not achievable at an acceptable cost. It is not about Iran defeating the United States. It is about Iran making itself too expensive to defeat. And here's the uncomfortable truth that serious analysts acknowledge even when it does not fit the simple narrative. That strategy might work. Not because Iran is stronger than the United States. It is not. Not because Iran has better weapons or a bigger economy or more powerful allies. It does not. But because the United States, powerful as it is, has its own limitations. It has its own political cycles. It has its own public opinion that shifts over time. It has its own competing priorities, a growing rivalry with China, economic pressures at home, political divisions that make it harder to sustain long commitments abroad. Iran has essentially built a strategy that takes all of those American limitations seriously. It is not trying to outpunch the United States. It is trying to outlast it, and the 4 steps it has put in place make the ground impossible. Spread the fire across the region, threaten the oil supply, and erode political will at home are all aimed at exactly that goal. Every single piece of that plan is already built. It is already positioned. The network of allies exists. The ground forces are trained. The Strait of Hormuz remains under Iran's gun. The political environment in the United States is already skeptical of new Middle East commitments. Asterisk what this means going forward, asterisk, and this does not require you to support Iran or oppose the United States. It does not require any political position at all. What it requires is the willingness to look at what is actually happening rather than what we might wish were happening. The world is not always a place where the most powerful country gets what it wants simply because it is the most powerful. History is full of examples where a weaker party managed to make the cost of conflict high enough that the stronger party eventually stopped. The British Empire, the most powerful force on earth in its time, eventually left country after country not because it was defeated militarily, but because the cost of staying became greater than the benefit. Iran has studied history. It has studied what works and what does not work for a country in its position. And it has built a strategy that draws on those lessons in a very clear and deliberate way. The strategy has 4 steps. Make the ground so difficult that no army wants to stay on it. Build a network that spreads any conflict across the entire region. Use the oil supply as a weapon against the global economy. And let the political costs inside the attacker's own country grow until the will to continue collapses. None of those steps require Iran to be as powerful as the United States. All 4 of those steps are already in place. That is the quiet strategy. That is the long game. That is what is actually happening beneath the surface of every news story about tensions, strikes, responses, and counter-responses in the Middle East. And whether you think it is right or wrong, whether you admire it or find it troubling, understanding it is the only way to understand what is actually going on, where things might actually go. Because in the end, the question is never just who is stronger today. The real question is always who is still standing when the dust finally settles.